In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at how to use Vertex Paint to add kind of things like rust, scratches and dirt to this kind of basic plane as a kind of metal panel. So primarily we'll also be covering how to use occlusion, roughness and metallic in one texture in order to save lots of kind of texture samplers when creating a Vertex Paint shader that has kind of multiple painting layer ability. So we can paint rust, dirt and scratches, for example, here. So you can see I've got 3 texture sets. I've got a tiling material for metal, again with albedo, normal, and then my 3 combined occlusion, roughness, metallic. I have scratches with the same set of 3 textures, and rust. Now it's important to note here that when you've got your combined masks, you should make sure that you set this to use masks, no sRGB here. We'll just hit save on that. So make sure you do that on all 3 of those, because UE4 typically won't do it by default. I think I have already set these. Let's have a look if I can have. Let's hit save. And I have done on the other ones. Okay, so what we'll do first then is we'll jump to our Vertex Paint folder, and I'm just going to go right click, make new material. I'm just going to call this Vertex Paint, I don't know, tiling combined. And we'll double click on that, make sure we've got it on the correct monitor. And the first thing we're going to do is just bring in our textures. So minimize this down a bit again. And we'll go to metal here and we'll bring in our metal albedo, and we'll go to rust and we'll bring in our rust albedo, so we know they're kind of 2 we're going to start with. The next thing we'll do is we'll create a lerp just by holding L on the keyboard and left clicking, and then we'll drag our base albedo, so our metal albedo, into A, and then our rust into B. So the next thing we're going to want to do is just create a vertex color node. So we'll right click, type in vertex and just add that vertex color node in and just drag that into alpha. So now if I just go onto my base color here and just hit save, in fact what I should do is just link this to one slot, so we'll just link this to red and just hit save. So we'll drag that onto our asset. Make sure we're out of Vertex Paint before we do that. And I'm just going to come to here and I'm just going to remove vertex colors off here. Now just to go through this tab a little bit more, if we have a look here, we can go to red channel. We can see we've got all red, we've got all green, and we've got all blue. And RGB channels, all of them combined obviously make white. So off, that's why we're seeing all the rust, because at the moment we have full red. So you can go the other way with this if you like. If you plug them in the other way around, then minus red off here instead of, then that will work. So if I just hit this button, that means I'm painting in black. So what I'm doing is, if I just go to red, and then make sure I've got red selected here, that means I'm going to be taking red out of this. So I can just strip red out completely like so. This is why it can be better to go the other way around and just have these swapped so that your base is actually in B and your layer that you want to paint is in A. It's up to you how you want to work. I kind of prefer it like this. So with that set up, the next thing we want to do is, because you can see when we paint, by the way, if you hold shift, that will invert your selection so that, invert your color so that you're painting in white instead of black, or vice versa. So at the moment when we paint, we can see that it just has a linear fall off from white to black, or red to no red, and it's just kind of linear gradient, so it doesn't look very good. So what we need to do is kind of use a height map in order to improve the look of this. Improve the fall off so that we get something that looks more realistic. So I should have a few textures here. I'm just going to use this rust map that I've made here. I'll make sure to include these in the download description anyway. And what we're going to want to do is just combine this with our vertex color so that when we're painting, the map is used to show visibility rather than just the vertex color. So first of all, I'm going to add a multiply. And with my multiply, I'm just going to multiply together the texture and the vertex color. And let's set this up to be a bit neater. You can always do it the other way around. It doesn't really matter which way around it is, but just to make it a bit neater, I'm going to do it like that. Next, we'll want to add a power node. And now we're going to use this power node combined with a scalar parameter. So just hold S on your keyboard to add the scalar parameter. And I'm going to call that blend power. And this basically will allow us to control like how much influence this has. So so if we just put a default value of 1 into there for now. Then we're just going to add a clamp node. And the reason we're adding a clamp node is just to make sure that our value never goes from lower than 0 or higher than 1. So next we'll just drop that into the lerp, into the alpha of the lerp instead, and just hit save. And already we can see we are showing that kind of rust layer through when we paint now. On our blend power, if we just try setting that higher, you can kind of start to see what that does. Or even lower than 1, and you can see what that does there. So you've got quite a lot of tweaking power with this kind of blend power node. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is set up some of our, let's just clean this up a little bit. So I'm putting him up there and putting him there. We'll leave that there. The next thing we want to do then is set up our roughness, occlusion and metallic. So obviously the difference here is if we just drag our base metal in, we have this split into our 3 kind of slots here. So what I'm going to do here is add this node here, because that will go right at the end here, and that will allow us to split these off. I'm then going to add a lerp node, and I'm basically just going to follow the exact same process that I've done up here. So I've got my base metal going into A, so we make sure our metal goes into A. I'm then going to go to rust, select this texture here, and drop that into B. I then should be able to just use my clamp, go straight into there. So you can basically, it's a replication of what I've done up here. The only difference is that should now plug into there. And now this will allow me to split my 3 different channels and send them off where I want them to go. So I know that if I just check my name, I've got occlusion, roughness, metallic, and that's occlusion, roughness, metallic. So I can put that into red, sorry, that into occlusion, and then my green is my roughness, and my blue is my metallic. So if we just hit save, we should start to see that update. Yeah, and that's working well. So exactly the same node set up here, so let's just duplicate this, drag that down here, and we're just going to use this for the normal. So rust normal goes into where our rust albedo was, and if we go to metal here, we can slot metal normal into there, whoops, like so. And then we can drag that. So we'll plug that into our normal slot, hit save. And we should see now when we come to paint this, we can take out areas of our rust, like so. And we can obviously shrink that down, and you can mess around with your blend power as well to see what works more effectively. And if we just apply the same material onto our, that is not the right material, if we just apply him onto there, obviously it's got some Vertex painting that I had on it before. We just select both of them, we can right click and go to group, and we can kind of paint this out and get a lot more kind of variety in our 2 assets. So obviously you can see if you had loads of assets here of the same kind. It's very easy to get some kind of nice variety in them. Okay, so let's have a look at how we would add a second layer to this. Well, it's simple enough. We'll start with the albedo. We'll drop a lerp in here, and we'll drag that straight into A. Then we will browse to our metal scratches. I'm just going to drag the albedo into here and slot that into B. Now what I'm going to have to do is just move these all down to here, because we're going to need to duplicate this this set here. So let's select all those, do right click, duplicate, we'll drag that down to there, and instead of using my red, I'm going to drag my green into A. Now obviously this mask here isn't particularly suitable for kind of scratches, so what we're going to need to do is say duplicate that and use a different kind of map in here. So I do already have one, something we can use. And we'll just try that. By the way, if you are getting an error down here where it's saying it's not set to linear color or whatever, just make sure that, again, like I mentioned before, you double click on there and make sure you set to masks, and then you'll need to set that to kind of masks as well. So maybe that one will be better anyway. And what have I got that one set to? Grayscale, kind of the same thing. I'm just going to set it to masks, so I've done that with the others. And come back in here and we'll set that to masks too. Okay, so with that set up, we just need to plug him into B. And then on here we take our alpha. So this time we've got the green going down to there, and that goes into our alpha here. So that means when we paint green, this is what will come through. And it will use this mask in order to bring that through. So you can see they all come on there straight away. And what we're going to want to do is just change our parameter down here for a start. So let's put that lower, like 1. So there we go, we can see our scratches on there. And another thing about the scratches is they're pretty massive, so let's try reducing that down a little bit. So we're going to add a multiply node in here, a scalar parameter, we'll call this UV tiling, and then we'll add a texture coordinate slot node, and we'll just drag that in there and that in there, and that into UV. And I'm just going to set my UV parameter here to 2, just so that the scratches tile twice. If I just hit save, see that update. Let's clean that up a little bit. Obviously you can do the same on your rust as well. We can duplicate this and have that assigned to there if you want to tile your rust more. Totally depends kind of what you want. Okay, so let's just jump in here. This time we'll turn off red and we're going to select green, and we're just going to paint out kind of areas of those scratches that we kind of might not want. So maybe we only want scratches in like kind of certain areas kind of thing. And obviously if I hold shift I can add scratches back in and so on. Okay, so now we have control over scratches as well as rust. But obviously we need to also kind of add them into our kind of slots down here. One thing I'm going to try is just going to try setting this to grayscale. This looks any better. I'm just going to drop that back in there because I'm just going to check to see whether it's actually having an impact over our kind of rust there. That's okay. Okay, so the next thing we want to do then is add another lerp in here. So just hold L and click. And then we're going to go to our metal scratches. We're going to select our occlusion, roughness and metallic, like so. We're going to drop that lerp into A, and we're going to drop him into B. And we're going to take our node up here and drop that into alpha. And then all we do is drop that into our float there. And then just hit save. And that will now give us control over, that now means that we're using our occlusion, roughness and metallic there too. And we need to do exactly the same here for our normal map as well. So add another lerp, we'll drop that one into A, and we'll drop him into B. And then we have to go all the way up here, go to our clamp and drop that into there, and then drop him into normal. So obviously one problem with you do have a Vertex Paint is you do end up with quite a kind of messy node tree. You can clean this up a little bit by maybe dragging that up to there and dragging that up to there. And then we just hit save. And you can see now we are getting a kind of better result there. So yeah, now we have control over our now we have control over two different layers. We can use rust with red, and with green we can use metal scratches, and we have our underlying metal. We've reduced our texture samples down quite a lot, and we're still on 14 though, so something you can do is actually change this to shared wrap. And what that will do is take that from using a texture sample and reduce the amount of them down, because basically with DirectX 11 you're limited to 16 texture samples. So once you start controlling red, green, blue and alpha, you can easily end up with a lot more than that in your shader, and it won't work. So once you hit that cap, UV4 won't like that, or DirectX 11 won't like that. So it's worth setting these to shared wrap just to bring that count down. Okay, so we can mess around with our blend power and so on. Okay, so you'll notice the material suddenly change. So I was just trying to figure out why this wasn't looking right, like my rust was looking odd, and I did figure it out in the end. So the reason was because I had two parameters here and they're both called blend power, which means when I was changing that one it was also updating this one. So what I've done is I've just updated this a little bit just to give them more kind of sensible names. So we know that this one refers to rust, so I'm going to call this one blend power rust. I'm going to call this one blend power scratch. And we'll call this one blend power rust. Basically, if you have a parameter with exactly the same name as another parameter, they're both going to update they're both going to refer to the same thing. It's really useful because it means you can have one parameter duplicated all over your material, and when you update it in a material instance, it's going to affect all of them at once. But in this case, when I duplicated it, it didn't rename it, so it meant when I was changing one, it was changing the other. So now you can see my rust is actually coming out looking better, so coming out looking more full because it's not using that parameter. So yeah, now that we fixed that, we've got our two working on there. We can change these independently. Obviously, one thing you can do is set up scalars for each of these, so you don't have to use this link to rust and so on. It could be linked to rust or dirt or anything like that, and you can change its materials as we did in our previous tutorial. So yeah, I think that's about it. So yeah, just remember you can set these to shared wrap to save yourself some texture samples. I'll be honest, I don't know if that adds any more computation to the actual shader, but it does save you when you're limited by that there. One thing I've done here as well, rather than use a separate texture, let's just recreate this actually. So rather than use a separate texture for the colour for the scratches, I decided just to add an add node in here. And then I added a constant value here. So I'm going to plug my texture into there and my constant value into here. And then I've just put in 0.6 in here. And basically all that's done is just brighten this albedo texture. So that's much cheaper than using a new texture. So I'm saving myself a whole texture sample there, and I've just got the colour set in there. So just to show you exactly what that's doing, if I just come into this and put red in there, let's say, and I'm going to drop that into B instead. Because the scratches are such a kind of fine detail thing, you know, we could get away with just using a colour value in there instead, so you can see the red appear in there. So using the add still gives us the texture detail that's in here. It just gives us a lighter colour, so we're kind of getting the best of both worlds with that. Okay, so let's save that. Yeah, so that's using how to use your packed textures in there correctly, and how to use kind of multiple channels for Vertex Paint. So all you need to do to add another one is just add another lerp, add another texture here, and clone these and link your blue into there, and then basically just duplicate this node tree again. So that's that.